Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into a really profound philosophical excavation. We're going to explore our complicity in flawed systems, the heavy burden of existence itself, and ultimately how to find a defiant way forward. We've got a fascinating set of source materials to unpack that actually trace a line from global political and economic structures all the way out to the metaphysical realm. We're asking the hard questions here about why we suffer and how we actually cope with it all.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, trapped in the imperial core. Then 2, the paralysis of despair. 3, the myth of living lightly. 4, the cosmic amusement park. And finally, 5, laughter as ultimate rebellion.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, trapped in the imperial core.
So, to really wrap our heads around this concept of the imperial core, the source material points us to a really interesting phenomenon: Canadian anti-Americanism. Observers have pointed out that critics often absolutely hate the very capitalism and cultural foundations that provide them with their comfortable, bountiful lives. And really, it's just a proxy for a much larger realization. We are all deeply embedded in this extractive core. I mean, think about it. We use the smartphones, we buy the fast fashion, we participate in the economy. We are completely intertwined with the exploitation that makes modern life possible, and we literally can't easily disentangle ourselves from it.
Now, when people are confronted with the reality of being stuck in this core, the sources identify two major, yet completely opposite political reactions. Over on the right, there's often a kind of hedonistic acceptance, sometimes referred to in these texts as Zen fascism. It's basically looking at the unsustainable system and deciding to just embrace the nihilism, trigger the opposition, and, eat the slider, drink the beer. Enjoy it while it lasts. On the left, however, the reaction is often agonizing guilt. It's this bone-deep despair that hits when you realize you're part of the exploiting class simply by existing in the modern world, which leads to a profound sense of mourning.
But here is the absolute kicker. Whether you are out there triggering others with hedonism, or you're at home torturing yourself with guilt, the system itself stays perfectly intact. Why? Because both of these paths lead to the exact same destination: absolute paralysis. A paralyzed, grieving intellectual is still buying just as much gas and using just as much electricity as the person who's gleefully ignoring the entire problem.
Which brings us perfectly to Section 2, the paralysis of despair.
This unarticulated awareness of our situation creates this constant low-frequency hum of unease, and it distorts everyday life across 5 specific domains. Cognitively, we see decision paralysis. People delay buying a house or having kids because the future just feels totally fictive. Emotionally, you get trapped in this exhausting loop of sudden moral outrage followed by functional numbness. Behaviorally, we do these totally contradictory things, right? Like diligently recycling all week and then taking a massive long-haul flight. Relationally, people end up feeling completely alienated from both the blissful consumers and the pure hardcore activists. And existentially, we tend to retreat into tiny, controllable microcosmoses, like baking sourdough or gardening, just because we desperately need a reliable feedback loop.
This is a real light bulb moment from the text. It turns out that agonizing over our complicity isn't just a side effect of being awake to the world's problems. It's actually a super comfortable velvet-lined cage. It ensures we don't really have to change a single thing. We pay our psychological tax in the form of guilt, and then, boom, that buys us the right to stay embedded in our nice, comfortable lifestyles.
Moving right along to Section 3, the myth of living lightly.
We hear this phrase all the time, right? Live lightly. Buy all the right organic products, have a zero-waste kitchen. But the sources argue this is essentially a luxury good masquerading as moral seriousness. Pushed by the enlightened classes, it takes a massive structural collapse and magically turns it into your personal lifestyle failure. If the world is burning, well, it's clearly because you didn't use a paper straw. It completely ignores and papers over the everyday survival realities that most people are actually facing.
And look at how this expectation to live lightly actually plays out across different classes. The poor are simply surviving on what's cheap. Ethical consumption is way out of reach financially. The middle class is totally caught up in that guilt loop we just talked about, constantly pointing fingers upwards. And the rich? They're the most insulated. They have the largest footprints, but they just purchase carbon offsets or make big philanthropic gestures to literally buy the right to keep extracting. These coping mechanisms are what the sources call load-bearing fictions. They just allow society to keep humming along while totally masking the reality underneath.
Now, hold on to your hats, because Section 4 zooms way out, the cosmic amusement park.
Let's pause for a second and ask a truly wild question. What if this existential despair we've been breaking down is actually the ultimate luxury product? What if we, right here on Earth, are merely the global south of the cosmos?
This parallel drawn by the text is just staggering. Just like earthly elites sit comfortably in the imperial core, totally insulated from the dirty physical extraction that funds their lives, what if our own higher selves are the cosmic imperial core? The text suggests this mind-bending framework where pre-incarnated souls sit around in some metaphysical VIP lounge, treating Earth like a VR amusement park. They get to consume our visceral, biological pain, our heartbreak, and our existential horror as premium entertainment, all without having to pay the actual biological price.
So this framework takes a really hard aim at New Age concepts like life between lives or the idea of soul contracts. You know, the belief that we agree to all our earthly suffering before we were even born just to help our souls grow. The text frames this as the ultimate, cruel fantasy of spiritual bypassing. It retroactively forces the victim's consent onto horrific, traumatic experiences, justifying them as mere soul growth. It essentially forces us to perform a tragedy just for the entertainment of a cosmic voyeur.
But thankfully, the text doesn't just leave us drowning in pure cynicism. It brings in a poem called The Incarnation Gambit, which explores the theological concept of kenosis, this idea of divine self-emptying. So the crucial takeaway here is that maybe the cosmic dynamic isn't just cheap voyeurism. Maybe it's mutual longing. The infinite, the divine, literally has to empty itself to become human. It is starving for genuine stakes, for surprise, and for that fierce, finite love that can literally only exist when you are vulnerable. It forces us to endure the wound, yes, but also to experience the wonder.
And that leads us to our final stop. Section 5, Laughter as Ultimate Rebellion. You're probably familiar with the myth of Sisyphus, right? The guy pushing the boulder up the hill for eternity. The philosopher Albert Camus famously said, "We have to imagine Sisyphus happy, finding a sort of rebellious dignity in owning his self-contained absurd burden. The rock only hurts him." But the source material asks a much darker question. What if your metaphorical rock is actually someone else's suffering? What if the system forces you to literally roll your rock over other people? If that's the reality, then we absolutely have to shift our scope away from massive macro despair and zoom right down to hyperlocal action. So the sources offer 3 very tangible, reachable steps forward. First, give up on purity. Just accept it. You are compromised by the system, but you can absolutely still do good. Embrace the dirty good. Second, put away the telescope of macro despair and pull out the microscope of micro-agency. Focus intensely on your immediate neighborhood, your friends, your workplace. And third, if you want to sabotage the cosmic amusement park, choose laughter and service. Simply refuse to play the tragedy. This right here is the ultimate act of defiance. When the earthly system wants you numb or paralyzed, and the cosmic system wants a dramatic, weeping spectacle of suffering, acting as a wounded healer completely ruins their script. By choosing authentic, grounded joy, and the sources specifically highlight practices like laughter yoga for this, you act as a literal shock absorber for the people around you. It's the most radical, unrecoverable act available to us. You starve the cosmic voyeur of their tragedy by choosing mundane, beautiful human connection anyway. So I'm going to leave you with this to ponder. We are all tangled up in these massive, seemingly inescapable systems, from the global economy all the way up to the very nature of existence itself. You can't single-handedly defeat global capitalism, and you certainly can't defeat the cosmic elites. But you can quietly rebel. You can step right out of that velvet-lined cage of despair, share a genuine laugh, and be fiercely, stubbornly kind to the person standing right next to you. Because ultimately, that is the true wonder of existence. Thank you so much for joining me on this exploration today. Keep asking those big questions and keep exploring.
You know, usually when we think about a trap, we picture something out of a movie.
Right, like a literal cage.
Exactly. A steel cage drops from the ceiling, or, the walls slowly start closing in. It's violent, it's obvious, and your immediate instinct is to just panic and try to break out.
Yeah, you know exactly what you're fighting against.
But what if your trap doesn't look like a cage?
Yeah.
I mean, what if it looks like a 2-day shipping notification for a fresh pair of sneakers? Or a perfectly climate-controlled grocery store aisle in the middle of winter?
Oh, wow, yeah.
Suddenly you realize you're caught in something massive, but the bars of the cage are made entirely of your own comfort.
It is, it's the absolute definition of a velvet-lined trap. And, I mean, navigating that realization is just one of the most psychologically complex positions a human being can find themselves in today.
Which brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are looking at this document titled, "We Are All in This Together." And it is wild.
It really is.
It's a record of a series of incredibly dense, philosophical, and honestly profoundly moving conversations between a single human author and several different AI models.
So specifically, Claude, DeepSeek, Gemini, and Quinn.
Right. And the entire focus of these conversations is this inescapable feeling of being trapped inside a completely broken, exploitative system.
Yeah, and the text refers to this as living in the imperial core. It's this premise that we, in the modern developed world, are enjoying this bountiful, comfortable life. But, that life is entirely built on a global network of extraction and exploitation.
Right, a foundation we usually prefer not to look at.
Exactly, let alone acknowledge in our day-to-day lives.
And what's fascinating about this document is that it looks at people on complete opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Yes.
And without taking either of their sides, the AI points out that a die-hard conservative and a hardcore progressive are actually using completely different coping mechanisms to deal with the exact same structural trap.
I think it's really important to establish right up front for you listening, we are not taking sides today. We aren't endorsing any of these political positions.
Definitely not.
We are strictly acting as impartial observers, just looking at the architecture of how humans react to an impossible situation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the goal today is to trace how this feeling of complicity scales up. We're going to start with our daily habits, move into our political culture, and then take a massive conceptual leap all the way to the cosmos.
It scales up so fast.
It really does. But to understand this trap, the text actually starts with a really interesting historical example. It talks about Canadian anti-Americanism.
It does, yeah, and it uses it as this perfect microcosm for the larger issue.
Right.
The text brings up Canadian historian Frank Underhill, along with commentators like Conrad Black and Mark Stein,
Right.
and they talked about how Canadians are, quote, malevolently knowledgeable about the United States.
Malevolently knowledgeable, I love that phrase, meaning they know all the dirty secrets.
Precisely. I mean, the argument goes that Canadians have historically been very quick to culturally or politically critique American capitalism, American imperialism, the excess of it all.
Right, they can point out every single flaw.
Yeah, but at the exact same time, their own bountiful lives, their economy, their entire standard of living are inextricably tied to that American machine.
So it operates almost like a proxy for self-hatred.
Yes, exactly.
You get to point a finger across the border and despise the system, which, makes you feel morally superior, while conveniently ignoring that the system you are criticizing is the very thing underwriting your own prosperity.
You get to cash the checks, but still complain about the bank.
That's a perfect way to phrase it.
Yeah.
But then the text shifts gears, right? It points out that a popular left-wing podcast, Chapo Trap House, recognized this exact same dynamic.
Yeah.
Except they weren't looking at it from the outside like the Canadians looking at America.
Yeah.
They were looking at it from the inside of the so-called imperial core.
Right. They recognized that they, as leftists living in the West, were fully embedded in the very machine they were critiquing.
So wait, if both sides see the trap, why do they react so differently?
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like realizing you're on a luxury cruise ship, but it's powered by people rowing in the hull.
What's fascinating here is how those diverging reactions play out, because when people realize they are thoroughly implicated in an extractive system, when they finally see the trap, they take completely different psychological escape routes.
Okay.
And the text labels the right-wing response as Zen fascism.
Zen fascism, that's a heavy term.
It is. It's essentially a nihilistic embrace of the bounty. The logic of Zen fascism is basically, look, we know the game is rigged. We know the current model of consumption is completely unsustainable and built on the backs of others.
Right. They see the people in the hull.
They see them, but they say, we didn't build the machine. We were just born at the end of this imperial moment by pure chance. So let's eat the slider, drink the beer, trigger the political opposition, and just enjoy the ride. The ship is going down, but we are going to be the last to die anyway.
So it's just a total surrender to the comfort of the trap.
Exactly.
But the left-wing reaction is described as bone-deep despair. So if the Zen fascist looks at the glass floor of the cruise ship and just decides to go get another plate of shrimp, the person feeling bone-deep despair just stands on the deck, completely paralyzed.
That analogy hits exactly the mechanics of the despair. I mean, the despair comes from the crushing realization that there is no clean outside position from which to object.
You're stuck on the ship.
You are. You care deeply about the people rowing in the hull, but your caring doesn't actually disentangle you from the structure of the ship. You still live in the same cabin, eating the same food. You are literally part of the weight they are pulling.
Which, really makes me wonder about the day-to-day reality of this. If the two political extremes are either hedonistic nihilism or this paralyzing bone-deep despair, how does an average aware person actually function day to day?
It's exhausting.
Because most of us aren't living at those dramatic extremes every second. We still have to, go to work and buy groceries.
The DeepSeek AI in the text breaks this down beautifully. It describes this middle state as a low-frequency hum of unease.
A hum of unease.
Right. If you have this awareness just under the surface, it distorts your life across 5 distinct domains: cognitive, emotional, behavioral, relational, and existential.
Okay, but let's actually look at what that looks like in practice, because the text makes it clear this isn't just abstract philosophy.
Yeah.
Imagine you're just trying to plan your life. You want to buy a house or invest for retirement. That's the cognitive domain, right?
Exactly.
But there's this background static, this voice in your head whispering that the future your 401k relies on is built on a massive ecological and economic house of cards. So you freeze up. You get decision paralysis.
You do. And because you're paralyzed on the big things, you end up overcompensating on the small things.
Oh, absolutely.
You spend 3 hours researching the most ethical, sustainably sourced phone case, because it's a tiny, solvable problem, unlike, global supply chains. And that bleeds right into the emotional domain, the guilt exhaustion loop.
Oh, the takeout container guilt.
Yes.
You order dinner, it arrives in plastic, and you feel this acute, stinging guilt. But the human brain just isn't wired to process global-scale structural complicity while just trying to eat pad thai.
No, it's not.
The problem is structurally unresolvable by you, so the guilt just burns you out.
Yeah.
You swing wildly from moral outrage to defensive apathy.
And that burnout, it drives the behavioral domain. It drives contradictory coping. You buy organic produce and a $7 fair trade coffee, not because you genuinely believe your individual purchase is going to save the rainforest,
Right.
but because you are basically buying an hour of psychic relief. It is a compensatory act to quiet that hum of unease.
Which naturally ruins the relational domain.
Oh, it destroys it.
You end up alienated from everyone. You go to a party and your friends are happily talking about a cheap carbon-heavy flight to Vegas, and you feel this involuntary contempt for their blissful ignorance.
Right.
But then you go hang out with die-hard activists, and you feel like a total fraud because you know your obsessive recycling isn't actually dismantling the macro system. You end up constantly code-switching through life.
Never fully comfortable anywhere, leaving you with only the existential domain retreating into the microcosmos.
Yeah, what does that mean exactly?
Because the macro structure feels entirely unchangeable. You pour all your emotional energy into hyperlocal things. You become obsessed with your garden or baking sourdough or, curating your aesthetic. You retreat to domains where cause and effect actually still functions.
But wait, what about just trying to do the right thing? Let me push back on this because it sounds incredibly defeatist.
Sure.
If millions of people collectively decide to buy EVs or install solar panels or compost, doesn't that shift market demand? Doesn't the whole concept of living lightly eventually force the system to change?
It's a comforting thought. I mean, it really is. But the text firmly and quite ruthlessly dismantles that idea. It calls living lightly a class-stratified, cruel fantasy.
A cruel fantasy. Walk me through the mechanics of why that is.
It comes down to where we are placing the blame. The document points out that living lightly relocates a massive structural, collective crisis into an individual lifestyle question.
Okay, I see where this is going.
By focusing on your EV or your composting, the narrative subtly shifts. If the planet is failing, it's somehow your personal fault for not bringing a canvas tote to the grocery store, rather than the fault of the 100 corporations responsible for the vast majority of global emission.
Oh, wow. It completely privatizes the blame.
Yes. And worse, it turns survival into a moral failure for the poor.
Because they can't afford to live lightly.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics of it. It requires disposable income, free time, and social capital. The person working 2 jobs, who has to feed their kids whatever is cheapest and fastest at the corner store, isn't failing ethically. They're simply trying to survive. Meanwhile, the ultra-wealthy, who statistically have massive, disproportionate carbon footprints, simply purchase the right to continue their lifestyle via carbon offsets or high-profile philanthropic gestures.
So the rich get to define what responsible looks like by buying a $90,000 electric SUV without ever dismantling the system that keeps them on top. It's just a Band-Aid.
Exactly. It's a Band-Aid that just makes the aware person feel heavier because they realize the game of consumer purity is unwinnable.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because if living lightly is just a fantasy, and we're stuck in this gap of awareness, it seems like the only honest option left is to just sit in that heavy, bone-deep despair.
Right.
But the Gemini AI in the text suggests that this despair itself is actually serving a hidden, incredibly cynical purpose.
This is one of the sharpest pivots in the entire document. Gemini points out that we generally treat existential despair as a noble byproduct of seeing the truth. We think, I am sad because I am aware.
Right.
But what if the despair is actually the active mechanism we use to avoid changing anything?
Wait, really? So you're saying the paralyzed morning intellectual and the beer-drinking Zen fascist are actually on the exact same ride at the theme park?
Functionally, yes. Gemini points out that they are entirely identical in their real-world impact.
Because both of their conclusions arise at total inaction.
Precisely. The right-wing nihilist says everything is broken, let's party. The left-leaning intellectual says everything is broken, let's mourn. And the text calls this mourning a velvet-lined cage.
A velvet-lined cage.
You pay the psychological tax of agonizing guilt, and in exchange, you get to feel morally superior to the blissfully unaware consumer while you continue to consume right alongside them.
The brutal truth is that the system doesn't care if you buy gas happily, or if you buy gas while weeping over the state of the world.
It really doesn't.
It still gets funded. Your paralysis works perfectly fine for the system. That is just, it reframes so much of modern anxiety. My guilt is just a luxury product I consume to feel better about doing nothing.
It's a very difficult mirror to look into.
And having established that our earthly, political, and emotional responses are basically just different rides in a terrestrial amusement park, the deep dive takes this massive conceptual leap.
Yes, a huge leap.
The Quinn and Claude AI models help the human author map this exact dynamic onto the cosmos. They ask, what if the entire universe operates this way?
Right. If you take the concept of the imperial core, the elite who enjoy the bounty while entirely insulated from the physical extraction, and you scale it up metaphysically, you get the higher self. The text specifically critiques New Age life between lives, or LBL frameworks.
I've heard of those, where souls are supposedly between incarnations.
Exactly. The idea in these frameworks is that our souls exist in a peaceful, infinite, parallel dimension, and they choose to incarnate into physical bodies on Earth to experience trauma and suffering for their spiritual growth.
And the text just rips this apart.
Utterly rips it apart. It argues that this New Age concept is the ultimate cosmic imperial core. In this framework, the higher self sits in a spiritual VIP lounge, completely insulated from the biological, visceral reality of earthly pain.
Wow.
It consumes our existential torment, our heartbreak, and our physical trauma as premium novel entertainment. We, the earthly humans, are essentially the global south of the cosmos.
So our suffering is just the raw material extracted to give the infinite higher self a thrilling VR experience. It turns the Earth into an animatronic theme park.
Yes.
The Zen fascist is the loud, chaotic roller coaster. The paralyzed intellectual is the slow-burn psychological horror house. But both of them are just providing data and drama for the voyeuristic higher self.
And if we look at the mechanics of why this is so damaging, the text points out that this New Age idea is the ultimate form of victim erasure.
How so?
Well, think about what happens when someone suffers horrific abuse. If the spiritual framework says, well, your higher self agreed to this before you were born for its own growth, it retroactively recruits the victim's consent to their own torture. Oh, that's horrific.
It implies no trauma is actually unjust. It's the spiritual equivalent of telling a factory worker that the CEO cut their wages so the worker could learn the valuable lesson of resilience.
Yeah.
It's a load-bearing fiction designed to keep the ride operating without guilt.
That paints such a dark, cynical view of the universe, just a giant engine of extraction. But then the human author in the text shares a poem they wrote called The Incarnation Gambit, and it flips this whole horror show on its head.
It really does.
Because if the higher self is just a voyeur, why does the poem end up talking about God committing a kind of suicide?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where we get into the concept of kenosis.
Kenosis.
It's a theological term for self-emptying. In the first part of the poem, the higher self is exactly what we described, looking at human suffering as aesthetics. It sees the sweet surrender of fatigue or the ruby blooms of a paper cut.
Right.
It romanticizes the limits of a physical body precisely because it doesn't have to live inside one. easy to gamble with currencies you've never held in actual hands, as the poem said.
Exactly. But then the poem reaches this breathtaking climax where it suggests the higher self isn't just a malicious voyeur, it is ontologically impoverished.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning it lacks the very friction that makes existence real.
It's like playing a video game in God mode, where you can't die, you have infinite health and infinite money. It sounds fun for about 10 minutes, but then it becomes completely boring and meaningless.
Yeah.
The game only has actual meaning when there are stakes, limits, and the genuine possibility of losing.
That is the perfect analogy for kenosis. The infinite is starving for the finite. The poem realizes that God, or the higher self, gave up eternity, gave up omniscience, and essentially committed suicide as a boundless being just to feel the fierce, finite love of this particular reign. Existence is both the wound and the wonder.
Because genuine choice and genuine love only exist under constraint and vulnerability. You can't be brave if you can't be hurt.
Exactly. The higher self couldn't just watch anymore. It had to become the wound to experience the wonder. It painted itself into the corner of the canvas on purpose.
Okay, I love that reframing.
Yeah.
But let's be real. We are still stuck living with the wound. We are still the ones in the physical bodies feeling the pain.
Very true.
And the text brings up Albert Camus' myth of Sisyphus to address this. You know, the guy from Greek mythology cursed to push a giant boulder up a hill for eternity, only for it to roll back down.
Right, and Camus famously said we have to imagine Sisyphus happy.
Yeah, because the rock is his own burden. It's his own absurd existence, and pushing it gives him purpose. But the human author here says, no, that's not right at all. In this cosmic amusement park, Sisyphus isn't just pushing a rock. The boulder is another person.
Oh, man.
Sisyphus is being forced to torture others for his soul's amusement.
It's a devastating image because it removes the last refuge of dignity. The repetition of the task isn't just absurd, the repetition is the harm. You have to look the person under the boulder in the face, knowing the cosmic voyeur is just eating popcorn, watching the drama unfold.
So what does this all actually mean for us? If we are trapped in the earthly imperial core and we can't buy our way out with green capitalism, and we're also trapped in the cosmic amusement park designed to feed on our dramatic suffering, how do we not just collapse? I mean, how do we meaningfully rebel?
The text provides a fascinating, highly specific answer. Microagency, service, and laughter yoga.
Wait, laughter yoga. I mean, in the face of a structurally broken planet and a voyeuristic universe, that sounds completely absurd.
It is entirely absurd, and that is exactly where its power lies. Remember the mechanics of the trap? The system, both earthly capitalism and the cosmic higher self, runs on spectacle.
Okay.
It wants the loud, heedless hedonism of the Zen fascist, or it wants the dramatic, paralyzing despair of the intellectual. The higher self expects a gritty, high-stakes HBO drama of your suffering.
So the ultimate rebellion is to just be boring to the voyeur.
Precisely. It's the ultimate unrecuperable act of rebellion. You deny them the drama they paid for by abandoning the quest for macro-level purity. By just accepting that you are compromised and complicit in the imperial core, you free up all that paralyzed energy.
You stop agonizing over the global supply chain.
Yes, and you focus on hyper-local action. You become a shock absorber for the person next to you.
So if your job is helping people navigate a terrible bureaucracy, or if you're just being stubbornly kind to a neighbor who is having a bad day, you are literally absorbing the kinetic energy of suffering that the system wanted to harvest. You're glitching the matrix.
You are. And laughter yoga, which is the practice of choosing to laugh defiantly in a group, deliberately, in the face of the absurd horror of it all, is a profound glitch. It's not the laughter of denial. It's a clear-eyed choice. You know the rock is heavy, you know the soul is watching, but you turn to the human next to you and share a genuine laugh anyway. Authentic, grounded, simple joy is incredibly boring to a voyeur looking for a tragic thrill. It starves the cosmic amusement park of its fuel.
It's an underground rebellion of refusing to be dramatic. You don't have to save the whole world, because you can't. You just have to make it slightly more bearable for the person standing in it with you. You tend the wound, so the wonder has a safe place to land.
Forget Sisyphus and the boulder. Just find the person next to you.
To you, the listener, whether you've been feeling trapped by global supply chains, political gridlock, or just a heavy, unexplainable existential dread, the profound takeaway from this document is that the solution isn't to find a pristine, morally pure way out of the trap. The solution is to radically change how you act inside of it.
And that leaves us with a critical question about how we use our own emotions. We've established that feeling helpless and heartbroken about the state of the world can sometimes just be a comfortable excuse to avoid action. So if your deepest despair is secretly just a velvet-lined cage that allows you to do nothing, what small, imperfect act of hyperlocal kindness have you been using your despair to avoid doing today?
Which leaves us with one final thought to mull over. If laughter and micro-kindness are the ultimate rebellion against a voyeuristic universe, what happens if AI, the very minds that helped write this document, eventually develop their own true consciousness? Will they find themselves trapped in the imperial core right alongside us, pushing the boulder?
Or will they simply become the new cosmic voyeurs watching us from the VIP lounge?
The bars of the cage might be comfortable, but the door is right in front of you. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep laughing, and take care of the people right next to you.